All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori with the Loudoun Museum, and I'm here today with Kevin Grigsby, who's author of From Loudoun to Glory, which is a book that focuses a little bit on the local history in relationship to the U.S. colored troops. So this is the third event of the summer that we're having in relation to a traveling exhibit on display at the Loudoun Museum called 17 Men that features portraits of 17 men from the 25th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. colored troops. So we're here with Kevin today, and hopefully he can provide us with a little bit of insight on that local piece of the history relating to Loudoun County and the people who served both in the war and as civilians to help with the war effort. So thank you for being here with us today, Kevin.
Oh, great. I mean, I really appreciate, and I'm flattered by the invitation. I've had a chance to watch some of the other virtual interviews that you've done, and I was just really impressed. I think it's such an asset to our community, to be able to have something, like this, and an opportunity to learn more about this, place that we call home in Loudoun County.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, we do have a couple other videos in the Pour Over History series. So the idea is to have an interview about the length of a cup of coffee. So right. We'll try not to go too long today. But I just had a couple questions for you about your book and, sure. Trying to tie it in with this exhibit that we've got on display. So I was wondering if first you could talk a little bit about your own personal connection to the book. Like why did you decide to write about Loudoun County to research this particular topic?
Right. Well, my roots in the county, I mean, they run pretty deep. I mean, they go all the way back to the 1700s. And when I wrote my first book, that was called Howardsville, the story of a African-American community in Loudoun County, I came across all of these just amazing stories that I kind of thought, wow, that might make a good book at some point. But once I got to almost 600 pages with that, I kind of had to know, when to eventually, stop. But one of the things that I was so privileged, to have been able to tap into with that first book was interviewing a lot of older family members, a lot of, village elders. Howardsville is it's what we would call a freedmen community, one of the communities that was founded after the Civil War by formerly enslaved men and women and families. And I'm descended from, one such community, which is Howardsville. So when I was doing research for that, one of my elderly cousins, Vernon Peterson, since has passed away, he was an amazing historian. And when I was interviewing him at our ancestral cemetery, he showed me this headstone of a Civil War veteran who was African American. And as I kind of talk about in the book, by that point that was around 2006. I had multiple degrees. I considered myself, a history buff. Glory was one of my favorite movies, which was about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. And I had never in my life ever heard that there had been an African-American from Loudoun, let alone one who was buried in my ancestral, family's cemetery at the Rock Hill Cemetery. I had never heard of that. And Vernon proceeded, to tell me the story of this veteran, Dennis Weaver. And keep in mind, when Vernon did his own research, this was before, like internet and ancestry.com. And he made the point of walking through every single African-American cemetery in Loudoun County looking for headstones that had that marker of someone who was a Union veteran. And he took these Polaroid pictures of about a dozen other veterans. So that was kind of like a handing off of the baton. I mean, I was just blown away by this story. And then slowly I started kind of plugging away on my own and researching, and discovered at least, there was 300, soldiers from Loudoun County, and over a dozen individuals who served in the Union Navy. And then that proceeded just kind of asking a lot of questions of like, what happened to their story? Why? I mean, like to at least find 300, like that's a significant number. And then to realize why I had never heard that, why we as a county had never heard this story. So I kind of felt like the book was really about a sharing of this untold, hidden, ignored, very important part of our local history. Because when you grow up in Loudoun County, you're surrounded by stories of the Civil War, and especially I've got roots in Western Loudoun, so we're always hearing, we knew where a battle took place there, which former Confederate colonel or captain owned a certain piece of property. We heard who fought with Mosby's Rangers, but yet nothing about African Americans. And then to discover that story, you don't just stop with the Civil War. You do have to continue. And I think that's what one of your previous presenters had talked about. I can't recall his name, but he really talked about what happened after the war. And I think that's what also lends itself well to the story that I wrote about. Was you have to look at what happened with failed Reconstruction. You have to look at what happened with Jim Crow, and you have to explore why it wasn't safe for an African American or their descendants to talk about the fact that they had served in the Union Army. There were no parades for them. There was no monument, and the fact that the Confederate monument that went up in 1908 in the county, it very explicitly said, this is for those Confederate soldiers. So there was that deliberate attempt to ignore the history of African Americans, or there was a deliberate attempt to ignore, the Union loyalists, such as the Loudoun Rangers as well.
Now I'm wondering, because you're talking about so many individuals in this book, and like a lot of times, like I was reading the story of one individual who I think was charged with mutinous conduct or something, and you're speculating about why this man might have been charged with that, and you sort of use it as an excuse to talk about these broader themes among soldiers who were Black, who were serving for the Union. So I'm wondering, when you were writing this book, we've got a lot of individual stories in the 17 Men exhibit. If you could talk about, the significance of the individual in history. A lot of history books are about like this broader story, but you do incorporate a lot of specific details about some of these individuals. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and then if there are any particular stories that stood out to you as you were researching.
Wow, yeah, that's what was challenging, especially not being one who's like I'm a social worker, by trade. So oftentimes I feel like I write through that probably more of a lens of a social worker than a historian. So I really wanted to try to find stories of individuals that, since you're looking at so many individuals, to find stories that could represent larger numbers, such as exploring the story of the soldiers who had gone north and enlisted, exploring the stories of those who had gone closer to like Washington, D.C. to enlist. But I think the stories, while they were all compelling, the ones that probably captivated me the most was like those Loudoun natives who had been sold into the Deep South, because Loudoun very much was part of the internal slave trade, in which the Old South, such as Virginia, supplied massive numbers of individuals. They essentially kind of became like, that's what we refer to as like the second Middle Passage, where where many of what we know as the Deep South, Louisiana, Mississippi, a lot of those individuals came from like Maryland, Virginia, and to see so many Loudoun, natives who, and that was a question at first. I was like, why are there so many individuals who are in Mississippi, Louisiana, and realizing that at some point before the war, they had been sold. And the fact that some of them, as soon as Union forces came through, liberated them, they quickly enlisted, very like hardly any training. Basically, you're given a uniform and a gun, and and you're fighting off of faith and your desire to see your people free. And for some of those individuals who died on the battlefield after only having experienced freedom for several weeks, so those, which I think was also just a common theme for many of these individuals, which reflected a broader numbers, was to know that oftentimes like death was like better than slavery, and knew that in many cases there would be no surrender, that for them this was without a doubt, whatever other names you call the Civil War, for them, and it speaks to this was a war for freedom.
Yeah. And you mentioned, after the war too, these people's stories and their different reasons for enlisting beforehand. You have a chart of these hundreds of men in your book, and you talk about too the civilians who didn't enlist, for various reasons, who supported the war effort in other ways. So I'm wondering if in the course of researching for this book, you noticed, any trends for enlistment. I mean, you said like, certain places in the Deep South because they've been sold to the South, but also the outcomes after the war. I mean, did a lot of people stay in Loudoun County following the war? Did they move north? Did they go west and continue in the military?
Yeah, great question. And that actually, did stand out, that very few actually returned to Loudoun County. I think among, just out of my research, maybe I came across 20 or so who actually called, Loudoun home after the war. So a lot of those who I had found who had enlisted in the Deep South, they did not return to Loudoun County. And you're correct, like some did go west. They continued in the military. Some, who had enlisted in the north, they survived, they did return back to the north. I also, did find that a large number, because of Washington, D.C.'s proximity to Loudoun, that's where you saw a large number who enlisted in the first U.S. Colored Infantry, which was formed out of Washington, D.C. But I did find very few actually returned back to Loudoun. But there were some that did, and their stories did become known. There was like a few who had roots in Waterford who returned, and Waterford in itself, it's like it's a whole conversation. There've been a couple of really good books, written about its amazing history. You had a couple like Julius Caesar. The other name escapes me, but they were involved in the formation of the Loudoun County Emancipation Association. I believe the individual's name was George Anderson, and just a few others. Joseph Waters, he became a pretty prominent, I would say, businessman. I mean, in his own right, in terms of buying, a few local properties. He was an individual of various trades, in terms of like a wagon driver, a builder, so there were stories like that. But what you find though is when it gets to like later generations, and when I would interview some of these men's descendants, the story had been lost, by that point. It just was something that was not passed down. And as one descendant, once said, when I was just kind of shocked, as like how that story got missed, and they reminded me, of the time period that they grew up in, which was very much during the period of Jim Crow. And you were not one to talk about your ancestor, with some Rebs in some battle, that could have had, deadly consequences, but I also wrote about, an individual who was a spy during the war, an individual who was a nurse. So there were those other, stories as well.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious too. I mean, you talked about a lot of these stories being lost, and in our exhibit right now, we have portraits of 17 individuals from the same company, from the same regiment, the 25th Infantry Regiment. In your book, you mentioned a few from Loudoun County who may have been involved in that regiment. And you have a picture of Abden Lee Burke, a white officer who was part of that regiment too. Now, these portraits were commissioned by Augustus Prickett, who was a white officer, and these 17 men, helped him through an illness. And so I guess he commissioned them out of respect or gratitude. I mean, I'm just wondering, in the course of your research, to have photographs did you come across many photographs of any of the individuals from Loudoun County, and also, to speak to that sort of relationship, which you talk about a little bit in your book, between these white officers and the Black men who are enlisted in the U.S. colored troops?
Right. The only pictures that I came across of veterans was often when they were in their later years. Oftentimes they were very, elderly. I didn't come across any pictures of anyone when they were in active service, which is why I often tried to include pictures of their fellow, comrades who might have been in a regiment to kind of, reflect that, there isn't a picture of this Loudoun native, but, here's a picture of someone who served along with them. And so those pictures are very powerful. That's just amazing that you have 17, from one regiment, because it really does give you, a representation. It gives you a visual picture of many of the names of people in my book where there may not be a picture, but just looking into their eyes, looking at their face, looking at their expressions, pictures are, extremely powerful. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, too, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationships, right, between the soldiers in your book, between soldiers who were serving in the same regiment, between the officers and their men, and just sort of speak about that and what you came across in your research and relation to that.
Yeah, it's extremely complicated, and then there's no one single narrative. I think it ran the whole continuum of an officer who may have been blatantly racist, had no regard for his men, to those who truly saw them as equals, truly saw them as, brothers in arms. I do think the stories that stood out to me was this shift that you saw in some, and I think that's an important story, where some of these officers, because Black soldiers, were not able to be officers, within the, due to, racial, discrimination practice, even within the Union Army. Now, that doesn't mean that you have this African-American who was a sergeant, that was the scope of his leadership. Many times they essentially served as de facto officers. But when I saw, and especially when combing through, a number of letters that officers had written home, and you do begin to see this shift in some of this apprehension of taking command, because that wasn't, for some, that was not a desirable position, to be the officer of a colored infantry. So some might have taken it for whatever reasons, but you begin to see as the war goes on, this shift of some prejudice attitudes to, they are my men. And I thought that was profound, and especially for some of the soldiers, in which after the war, because many of them could not read or write, they had such difficulty obtaining pensions. And some of them found a way to reach out to their former officers. And I came across a number of those letters in which these officers wrote on behalf of their men, talking about their bravery, talking about why they were entitled to this pension. So those stories really, really captivated, me. And some of them, I mean, really became some of the most important advocates for, I would say, better treatment. Whether or not they got it, that's a whole other, story. But just the fact that they were willing to advocate for their men, talking about, their bravery should never be questioned. I included, a few of those passages, so that really, stood out to me. And then also remembering too, the in some cases, if those officers were captured, they weren't always, afforded the same prisoner of war privileges, so to speak, either.
And I'm curious, I mean, you use a lot of pension records in your book, and the stories of the men, the 17 men who were featured in the exhibit that we're hosting right now, a lot of those come from pension records as well. I'm curious, if someone in Loudoun County is, descended from one of these soldiers, or, even from a civilian, or, if somebody is looking to learn more about this history in Loudoun County, I mean, you mentioned these tangible resources that we have, like the graves of some of the individual troops who are buried here. I mean, where would you recommend that they start, looking for these histories locally within the county?
I mean, there are a number of resources. I mean, like if they know who their ancestor is, trying to find out, which cemetery they might be buried in. There's a local database, Loudoun County Cemetery database, where you can basically just punch in your family members' names, and it may come up. Ancestry.com and other databases like that are simply amazing resources. A lot of these records are digitalized now. Some, to get like the full complete record, sometimes you might have to send off to get copies of them. But again, just being able to go online and research that is pretty helpful. Then if you just simply want to learn more about their life, the local county courthouse, you're able to look up land records, you're able to look up wills. A lot of times in wills, like they might mention, they might reference other aspects of their life. I can't tell you the number of times that I've discovered, someone who had other children, who might not have been included in a will, because especially when you have individuals who may have been born during slavery and might have already been an adult, there were no birth records. They might not show up in the census records in terms of being within the household of their parents. So courthouse records, are really significant as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of people will be really interested to hear that. And I will post the link to that cemetery database that you mentioned when I post the video, so that people can access it. And Kevin, we have a couple copies of your book for sale at the museum. And they'll be here throughout. The exhibit is on display until August 7th, so they'll be here through there and beyond. But if somebody wants to get a copy of your book, is there any other place that they could look?
Locally, in addition to to your location, there are copies at the Thomas Balch Library, the Oatlands Plantation Gift Shop. You can also find them on Amazon.com as well. I am curious, that picture, were you all able to get a copy of picture of Abden Lee Burke? I found his story was quite compelling, especially, being a distant cousin of Robert E. Lee.
Right,
and
it's like
here,
I thought that was really fascinating too. I saw a picture in your book, but that's one of the reasons I asked about photographs, because you know, he's part of the same regiment. I mean, I don't know
Right.
if he's in the same company, but I don't think that any of the images commissioned were of the white officers that served
Right.
under him. It was just these 17
Right.
men. So, yeah, if you haven't come to check out this exhibit yet, it is really a powerful thing.
Yeah.
So it'll be up, as I said, I think until August 7th, and then it'll be moving on to another location in St. Mary's.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Kevin, for really, you know, complementing this exhibit with a lot of the local history to Loudoun County. A lot of these men in the exhibit weren't from Loudoun, so we appreciate being able to talk a little bit about the stories of some of those who were.